In July 1998, I stood outside Interpol headquarters in Lyon, France, confident on how to blow up the building. Interpol had been bombed once before, in 1986. The explosion caused significant damage but failed to bring down the old headquarters in Paris. The new headquarters in Lyon was far more secure, or so the organization claimed. But I'd found a vulnerability. Not that I had much power to take action. Fortunately, I wasn't standing outside Interpol alone, and my companion had all the influence I lacked. I was nervous to share my strategy, as I questioned how responsive my companion would be. So I backed into it with, "Hey Ron, if you wanted to blow up Interpol, could you do it?" "Easily," he responded. "How?" Ron dove into an explanation of his tactics. His plan lacked subtlety, to say the least, which told me he was unaware of the security vulnerability I'd found. Most importantly, his voice remained light and conversational. That was a good sign. I'd been afraid he'd chew my head off for broaching the subject, but once I heard how he'd proceed with his own strategy, I knew he'd be willing to listen to mine. Affable as Ron normally came across, he wasn't one to be trifled with. I'd learned that the hard way when I first applied to work with him. My roommate had told me to include a conversation piece on my resume, so I added a blurb about backpacking around the world and included a list of the countries visited. "I see you've been to Cuba," Ron said after looking over the resume. "Do you know the legal penalty for a U.S. citizen traveling to Cuba?" This conversation starter was proving a little too effective, and I didn't like the direction this was going. I knew I'd broken U.S. law when I entered Cuba in the winter of 1996, but hadn't considered it a big deal. I'd never looked into the exact penalty if caught, but Ron knew, and he started telling me the consequences I could have faced, in detail. Though he was a law professor, I was surprised by his legal knowledge in this area. I doubted anyone else at NYU Law would have had a clue about the issue. "You seem to know an awful lot about the penalties for going to Cuba," I said. "Well, that was my branch of government," Ron replied. This interview just kept going downhill. "Let me get this straight," I said. "You used to work for the branch of the government in charge of arresting me when I went to Cuba?" "No, Dave. I used to run the branch of government in charge of arresting you when you went to Cuba." Google didn't yet exist, but it didn't take me long to research the true identity of this mild-mannered law professor. Ronald K. Noble, former Undersecretary of the Treasury for Defense, in charge of the Secret Service, the Customs Service, and the Division of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, all of which are now under the Department of Homeland Security. My initial fears that my visit to Cuba would cost me the job proved unfounded. Ron wanted to hire an assistant to help him with a mission that summer at Interpol, and the last thing he wanted was someone he'd have to babysit. He later told me my backpacking experience was key to landing the job. He figured I'd have no problem looking after myself in a foreign country. And that's how we came to be standing outside Interpol a few months later, discussing how to blow it up. Once Ron finished telling me how he'd take down the building, I launched into my own strategy, complete with a description of the security vulnerability I'd found. "No, that can't be," he said. "Check it out yourself," I replied, and he did. The next day, he got back to me in total shock. I apologized for not explaining either Ron's plan or my own. Ron became Interpol Secretary General 2 years later, so I'm fairly certain he either convinced his predecessor to fix the vulnerability or took care of it himself. But without 100% certainty, I'm not willing to jeopardize Interpol's security. Besides, the point of this story isn't to help my readers become more effective terrorists. So what is the point? To introduce another powerful tool in the failure toolbox, the pre-mortem. We already looked at postmortems, which help us determine the errors that led to a failure so we can do better in the future. Advocates of pre-mortems ask, why delay such an analysis until after a disaster? If you can anticipate danger areas in advance, you can often prevent catastrophe. By asking, how would I blow up Interpol? I could discover and repair security vulnerabilities before the organization's enemies could find them.